The year is 2060. Imagine you're standing in the heart of Riyadh. The sun is still brutal. The desert still stretches endlessly in every direction. But something crucial is missing. The oil wells ran dry 10 years ago. If history were a reliable guide, you should be surrounded by silence. Empty highways. Abandoned towers. A modern ruin slowly swallowed by sand. A cautionary monument to a civilization that lived fast, burned everything, and forgot to prepare for the day the resource stopped flowing. That is the pattern, repeated again and again across human history. When the resource dies, the empire usually dies with it. Spain flooded itself with New World gold and mistook windfalls for productivity. When the silver stopped arriving, the empire hollowed out from the inside. Nauru strip-mined its phosphate, briefly becoming one of the richest places on earth, then collapsed into debt, obesity, and dependency once the ground was gone. Venezuela built an entire political system on oil rents. And when prices fell, the social contract disintegrated almost overnight. Resource dependence is a curse disguised as a blessing. It delays reform. It rewards stagnation. It trains societies to consume instead of build. By every historical precedent, Saudi Arabia should have followed the same path. And yet, it didn't. Instead of decay, Riyadh is louder than ever. Cranes dot the skyline. Construction zones stretch for miles. Capital is moving faster, not slower. New industries are appearing where oil rigs once dominated the imagination. Saudi Arabia is not retreating from the end of oil. It is charging directly into it. What you're watching right now may be the most aggressive, expensive, and ambitious economic pivot ever attempted by a modern state. Not a reform. Not a diversification effort. A full-scale reinvention. The kingdom is not merely trying to survive the post-oil world. It is trying to buy the future before the rest of the world realizes that the future is already for sale. From global sports leagues to your favorite video games. From artificial intelligence infrastructure to cities that look like unfinished science fiction renders. From luxury tourism to green energy dominance. Saudi Arabia is rewriting the rules of state capitalism in real time. And the unsettling part is this. So far, it's working. Welcome to the post-oil blueprint. Before we go any further, we need to clear the air. Talking about Saudi Arabia tends to fracture the room instantly. On one side, you have geopolitical critics focused on human rights, authoritarian control, and moral accountability. On the other, you have business realists watching capital flows, balance sheets, and long-term strategic positioning. Today, we're going to set politics aside. Not because they don't matter, but because they don't explain what's happening. This is not a moral story. It's an economic one. What's unfolding inside the kingdom right now is a roughly $3 trillion experiment in forced transformation. A high-risk attempt to redesign an entire society before its primary revenue source becomes structurally obsolete. The official name is Vision 2030. Unofficially, it's something closer to this. Operation Don't Become a Museum Exhibit. Because history is littered with once powerful civilizations preserved behind glass, admired, photographed, and irrelevant. Saudi leadership understands something brutally simple. Oil doesn't disappear overnight, but it does lose leverage gradually. And when leverage disappears, influence follows. So the kingdom is attempting something rare. It is using today's oil money to purchase tomorrow's relevance. That means turning a conservative, inward-facing petro-state into a global hub for entertainment, logistics, tourism, advanced manufacturing, green energy, and artificial intelligence. Not organically, not patiently, but forcefully. This is high-stakes capitalism executed with centralized political power. It's messy. And it relies on financial tactics that would make most Western governments and Wall Street itself uncomfortable. Because Saudi Arabia is not playing the long, polite diversification game. It's brute-forcing the future. And to understand how they're doing it, you have to follow the money. Every pivot, every spectacle, every futuristic render traces back to a single institution. A fund so large it bends markets around it. A fund that doesn't behave like a pension manager, but like a sovereign venture capitalist with infinite patience and near-total political backing. The Public Investment Fund. If you've never heard of it, that's intentional. Historically, sovereign wealth funds were designed to be boring. Norway's fund invests conservatively. It buys blue-chip stocks, collects dividends, and quietly prepares for the day oil revenue fades. It is responsible, predictable, almost invisible. Saudi Arabia looked at that model and rejected it entirely. Under the leadership of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, the Public Investment Fund was transformed from a sleepy holding entity into one of the most aggressive capital deployment machines on earth. This is not a savings account. It's a weaponized balance sheet. By the mid-2020s, the fund was managing close to $1 trillion in assets, with a mandate that goes far beyond returns. Its job isn't just to make money. Its job is to reshape the Saudi economy itself. That distinction matters, because the PIF doesn't simply invest in companies. It invests in leverage, technology transfer, industry creation, demographic absorption, cultural normalization. This is not diversification in the textbook sense. It's forced evolution. And it begins with a simple insight that most countries never get the chance to act on. If you control the capital, you can compress decades of development into a single political cycle. Saudi Arabia is attempting in 15 years what took other nations 52, 100. And that kind of acceleration always comes with risk, but it also comes with power. In the next section, we'll break down the first pillar of the blueprint, the financial engine that makes all of this possible. How Saudi Arabia used the chaos of global crises to go shopping. How it buys not just equity, but entire industries. And how oil money is being converted into technological and human capital at a scale the modern world has rarely seen. This is where the real strategy begins. If you want to understand how a country pivots away from the very thing that made it rich, you don't start with ideology. You start with cash flow. In Saudi Arabia, every serious economic transformation leads back to the same place, the Public Investment Fund. Think of it less like a sovereign wealth fund and more like a state-backed venture capital firm with geopolitical objectives. One that doesn't answer to quarterly earnings calls, activist shareholders, or election cycles. It answers to a single question: how do we replace oil before oil replaces us? The scale alone is difficult to comprehend. By the mid-2020s, the fund was managing roughly $925 billion, with an explicit target of crossing the $1 trillion mark. That puts it in a different category than most institutional investors. At that size, you don't just react to markets. You shape them. Here's the core misunderstanding most observers make. They assume Saudi Arabia is trying to earn its way out of oil dependence through investment returns. That's not the objective. Returns are secondary. What the kingdom is actually buying is capability. Let's rewind to 2020. The world shuts down. Markets crash. Airlines ground fleets. Office towers empty. Panic spreads faster than the virus itself. Governments scrambled to keep systems alive. Most institutions freeze. Saudi Arabia didn't. While households were hoarding toilet paper and corporations were trying to figure out remote work, the PIF went on a shopping spree. Billions flowed into companies whose stock prices had collapsed not because they were broken, but because the world was temporarily paralyzed. Airlines, entertainment giants, consumer brands, technology platforms. This wasn't reckless. 'Twas predatory patience. They bought when fear peaked. They sold selectively as markets recovered, and in many cases, they held. But the stock trades were never the main story. The real pivot was structural. Instead of just buying shares, Saudi Arabia began buying industries. Take electric vehicles. While the world obsessed over Tesla, Saudi Arabia quietly took a majority stake in Lucid Motors, a rival still early in its scaling phase. On the surface, it looked like a speculative bet. But the deal came with a condition. Lucid had to build manufacturing capacity inside Saudi Arabia. That clause changes everything. Because now, this isn't just an equity investment. It's a technology transfer agreement. Saudi Arabia effectively said, "We'll fund your growth, but in exchange, you'll teach us how to build the future." Factories mean engineers. Engineers mean skills. Skills mean domestic capability. This is the blueprint repeated again and again. Capital first, conditions second, local absorption third. And it extends far beyond cars. Consider gaming. To an outsider, Saudi Arabia spending billions on video game companies looks frivolous, a distraction, another rich country indulgence. But look at the demographics. Roughly 70% of the Saudi population is under the age of 35. This generation doesn't dream of oil rigs. They don't want government sinecures. They grew up online. They want to code. They want to design. They want to compete in digital worlds that didn't exist when their parents were young. The PIF understood this early. Through subsidiaries like Savvy Games Group, Saudi Arabia poured nearly $8 billion into acquiring stakes across the global gaming ecosystem. Nintendo, Electronic Arts, Take-Two Interactive. They didn't stop there. They bought ESL, the Electronic Sports League, outright. This wasn't about profit margins on game sales. It was about infrastructure. Gaming studios create high-skilled jobs. Esports ecosystems anchor media rights, sponsorships, live events, and global attention. And digital entertainment scales without geography. Oil is finite. Digital IP is not. By owning platforms instead of just content, Saudi Arabia is positioning itself at the intersection of youth, culture, technology, and global consumption. Critics call this unsustainable spending. But that criticism misses a crucial detail. Saudi Arabia sits on some of the cheapest oil reserves on the planet. Its extraction costs are among the lowest globally. That means cash flow, even in a declining oil world, remains enormous for longer than most competitors. Sustainable looks different when your marginal cost advantage is structural. The kingdom is deliberately burning today's furniture to build tomorrow's rocket ship. This is not incremental diversification. It's forced diversification. New industries aren't being encouraged. They're being installed. The PIF floods capital into sectors Saudi Arabia wants to own, then builds the domestic ecosystem around them: training programs, industrial zones, supply chains, and regulatory carve-outs. It's brute force economics. And it only works under two conditions. First, centralized political authority capable of moving quickly without internal vetoes. Second, enough capital to survive mistakes. Saudi Arabia has both. But money alone doesn't solve one critical problem. Perception: you can build factories, fund startups, and import talent, but none of it matters if the world refuses to engage with you. Investors won't come. Tourists won't visit. Executives won't relocate their families. Which brings us to the most controversial pillar of the post-oil blueprint. Not factories, finance, but spectacle. Because before Saudi Arabia could sell the future, it had to change the story people told about the country itself. And the fastest way to rewrite a global narrative isn't diplomacy, it's entertainment. In the next section, we'll examine the kingdom's global brand rehabilitation strategy, why buying sports leagues, superstars, and global events isn't vanity spending, but a calculated customer acquisition strategy at a civilizational scale. This is where economics collides with culture, and where the pivot becomes impossible to ignore. Now we have to talk about the elephant in the room. Or more accurately, the Cristiano Ronaldo in the room. Because from the outside, Saudi Arabia's spending spree in global sports looks like pure vanity. Like a rich kid arriving late to the party and trying to buy attention with the biggest, loudest toys. Hundreds of millions for aging football stars. Billions for golf. Formula One races in the desert. A World Cup bid that seems less like ambition and more like inevitability. It's easy to laugh at. It's even easier to moralize. But if you do that, you miss the mechanism. This isn't just sports. This is brand engineering. And in a post-oil economy, brand is not decoration. Brand is infrastructure. Because oil doesn't need you to be liked. Oil only needs ships, pipelines, and buyers. But tourism does. Foreign investment does. Talent migration does. To build a diversified economy, Saudi Arabia had to solve a problem that money alone cannot fix. It had to become a place the world could imagine itself entering. 10 years ago, when most people heard Saudi Arabia, a predictable set of images appeared. Endless sand, oil barrels, strict social codes, religious police, and, depending on who you asked, diplomatic incidents that made headlines for all the wrong reasons. That brand image is poison for a future built on visitors, foreign employees, global capital, and international events. So the kingdom did what modern systems always do when faced with reputational collapse. It bought a new narrative, not through press releases. Through spectacle. Economists have a term in marketing: customer acquisition cost CAC. The idea is simple. If you want new customers, you pay up front to get them into your ecosystem, trusting that lifetime value will eventually exceed the cost. Saudi Arabia applied that logic at the scale of a nation-state. They paid billions to place their name into the daily feed of the planet. Enter the Ronaldo effect. When Cristiano Ronaldo signed with Al Nassr on a reported deal worth around $200 million a year, the world reacted with mockery. He's finished, they said. A retirement league. A vanity move. But here's what those critics didn't understand. Saudi Arabia wasn't buying goals. It was buying global attention. Because when Ronaldo moves, cameras follow, brands follow, journalists follow. And millions of fans, especially the young, begin to associate Saudi Arabia with something other than oil or controversy. Fast forward, the Saudi Pro League starts appearing in feeds across continents. Broadcast deals expand. Clips go viral. Jerseys appear in Tokyo, London, and Rio. Riyadh starts showing up in influencer content, not as a remote petro capital, but as a location tag worth flexing. This is not accidental. It is normalization by entertainment. And then came the Gulf War. Live Golf looked at first like a billionaire tantrum, a rival league paying enormous sums to lure players away from the PGA Tour. But again, look at what golf represents. Golf is not a mass spectator sport in the same way football is. Golf is where corporate influence gathers. It's the game of CEOs, sovereign wealth managers, hedge fund titans, political donors. Deals are discussed on fairways because the setting lowers defenses. The sport itself becomes a social lubricant for elite networks. So when Saudi Arabia poured roughly $2 billion into fracturing professional golf, eventually forcing the PGA into merger negotiations, wasn't just about sport. It was about forcing the global corporate class to engage. Because you can ignore a country you dislike until it owns the clubhouse. And then there is the deadline strategy. The jewel in this plan, the biggest forcing function, is the 2034 FIFA World Cup. Whether officially confirmed or not, Saudi Arabia has been positioning itself as the inevitable host. And the World Cup isn't just a month of football. It's a deadline that cannot be negotiated with. If you commit to hosting the World Cup, you get to pause your infrastructure plan because markets are uncertain or bureaucracies are slow. You must build stadiums, hotels, metro lines, airports, security systems, transport corridors, entire new districts by a fixed date. A hard deadline slices through red tape like a knife. It turns someday into, we have 8 years. This is the hidden genius of the sports strategy. It creates non-optional timelines. Vision 2030 is a plan. The World Cup is a clock. Now here's the darker truth behind all of it. The outrage cycle is short. The entertainment cycle is long. People will debate moral issues on social media for a week. But they will watch the World Cup for a month. They will watch F1 every year. They will watch their favorite athletes and influencers posting content from Riyadh season after season. Sports has a unique ability to rewrite perceptions because it bypasses logic. It moves through emotion, loyalty, identity, habit. And habit is the most powerful form of normalization on Earth. This is why critics use the term sports washing. But from the kingdom's point of view, it's something more clinical. A global brand rehabilitation campaign. A rebranding operation designed to make Saudi Arabia feel less like an exception and more like a node, like Dubai, Singapore, London, a stop on the global circuit. And once the brand is normalized, the next phase becomes possible. Because now you can sell the truly ambitious thing. The thing that isn't just entertainment, but identity. The project that exists as both a physical construction and a psychological weapon. The mirrored city in the desert. The world's most controversial urban experiment. NEOM. In the next section, we'll enter the sand. We'll break down the line $500 billion marketing stunt that might actually be real. Why it matters even if it's never completed. And how its true purpose isn't to house citizens, but to import talent, rewrite regulations, and signal to global capital that Saudi Arabia is open for the future. And once you see that function, the entire blueprint becomes clearer. You've seen the images. You've seen the memes. A city carved into the desert like a blade. It's a perfectly straight line stretching 170 kilometers. Walls rising 500 meters into the air, wrapped in mirrors, reflecting sky and sand back at the world. No cars, no streets, only high-speed rail, automation and AI-driven infrastructure. It looks less like urban planning and more like a concept artist forgot to stop rendering. This is NEOM, and at its center sits the most controversial element of all. The line, if the Public Investment Fund is the engine of Vision 2030, NEOM is the hood ornament. The thing designed to be seen first, debated endlessly, and never ignored. Officially, NEOM carries a price tag of around $500 billion. Unofficially, almost no one believes that number will hold. Megaprojects never do. Costs expand. Timelines slip. Complexity compounds. Critics call it delusional. Architects call it unbuildable. Engineers point to wind loads, heat management, ecological disruption, bird migration, and the sheer absurdity of servicing millions of people inside a linear structure. On paper, the line reads like a simulation pushed too far. And yet, this is where the story gets uncomfortable. Because NEOM doesn't need to be finished to succeed. It doesn't even need to reach 170 kilometers. Its real function is already working. Imagine you're a systems engineer in Berlin, a sustainability specialist in Copenhagen, an architect in Chicago, an AI infrastructure designer in Toronto. The job market back home is tightening. Inflation is eroding savings. Housing costs are climbing faster than wages. Then the call comes. $300,000 a year, tax-free housing included, state-backed funding, a once-in-a-generation project. You hesitate, then you pack. This is NEOM's true purpose right now, not as a city, but as a global talent magnet. Saudi Arabia is importing expertise at scale: engineers, designers, urban planners, energy specialists, desalination experts faster than most countries can train them domestically. This is capability arbitrage. Instead of waiting decades to organically grow talent pools, the kingdom is buying time by buying people. And it's doing so inside a controlled environment. Because NEOM is not just a construction site, it's a sandbox, special economic and social zone with its own rules. Inside, NEOM regulations loosen, dress codes soften, lifestyle restrictions relax. Not everywhere, not completely, but enough. This is deliberate. Saudi Arabia understands that nationwide reform risks backlash. Cultural change imposed too quickly can fracture legitimacy. So instead of reforming everything at once, the kingdom is testing a parallel system. Behind mirrored walls, it can experiment. New labor laws, new social norms, new regulatory frameworks, new energy systems. If something fails, it fails locally. If something works, it can be scaled. This is controlled liberalization. And behind the architectural spectacle lies the real strategic bet: energy. NEOM is becoming a hub for green hydrogen anchored by one of the largest planned renewable-powered hydrogen facilities on Earth. Saudi leadership understands a crucial truth. The world may be moving away from oil, but it is not moving away from energy. Energy demand doesn't disappear, changes form. So the strategy is not to abandon dominance, it's to transfer it. From oil exporter to energy exporter. From hydrocarbons to electrons, hydrogen, and infrastructure. NEOM is the brochure for that future. Flashy, controversial, polarizing, and impossible to ignore. Even if the line is never completed as advertised even. If only fragments are built, the signal has already been sent. Saudi Arabia is open to capital, open to talent, open to experimentation. And in a world where most countries are paralyzed by political gridlock, that signal alone has value. But NEOM is not meant to stand alone. It feeds into something broader. Because even if Saudi Arabia attracts global talent and builds futuristic cities, still faces a fundamental economic challenge. You can't replace oil revenue with tourists alone. And you can't rely entirely on foreign visitors to sustain growth. The real prize isn't foreign money. It's domestic spending. For decades, Saudi Arabia suffered from a silent economic leak, one so large it reshaped regional economies. In the next section, we'll uncover the boredom tax, how billions quietly left the country every year, and why Vision 2030 is as much about keeping Saudi money at home as it is about attracting foreign cash. This is where the pivot becomes personal. To understand why Vision 2030 matters so much, you have to understand a concept most people never see. Economists call it economic leakage. It's what happens when money earned inside a country is consistently spent somewhere else. For decades, Saudi Arabia was one of the most expensive places on earth to be bored. If you were a young Saudi with disposable income and ambition, the pattern was predictable. Movies, Bahrain, shopping, Dubai, concerts, London, nightlife, anywhere but home. Every summer, private jets and commercial flights carried billions of riyals out of the kingdom, not for investment, not for business or entertainment. Saudi consumers were quietly subsidizing the economies of their neighbors. And this wasn't a cultural accident. It was structural. For years, rigid social controls acted like an invisible tax on domestic consumption. Entertainment was restricted. Public gathering was limited. Mixed-gender spaces were heavily regulated, so demand didn't disappear, it relocated. Vision 2030's most underappreciated insight is this: you don't need to invent new wealth if you can keep the wealth you already generate. This is where the pivot turns inward. Because beneath the mega projects and global branding, Saudi Arabia was executing something far more subtle. It was reversing the boredom tax. The bans began to fall. Cinemas reopened in 2018 after decades of prohibition. That single policy change unlocked an entire domestic industry overnight: distribution, marketing, venues, jobs. Then came Riyadh season, a state-organized festival of concerts, sporting events, attractions, and spectacles that transformed the capital into a consumption engine for weeks at a time. Then came MDL Beast Soundstorm, a massive desert music festival drawing hundreds of thousands of attendees. 10 years earlier, public mixed-gender dancing would have triggered mass arrests. Now the state was organizing the event. This wasn't accidental liberalization. It was targeted economic policy. Every riyal spent on a concert ticket in Riyadh is a riyal not spent in Dubai. Every hotel booking at home is a hotel booking not made abroad. Domestic spend capture is one of the fastest ways to stimulate non-oil growth, and Saudi Arabia moved aggressively once it recognized the leak. But entertainment was only the visible layer. The deepest economic unlock came from something far more mundane: mobility. In 2018, Saudi Arabia lifted the ban on women driving. International media framed it primarily as a human rights milestone, and it was. But economically, it was seismic, because mobility is productivity. Before the change, millions of women faced a hidden tax on employment. Commuting required paid drivers or complex arrangements. Work often cost more than it paid. Once the restriction was removed, the math changed instantly. Labor force participation surged. Female participation rose from roughly 17% in 2016 to over 35% within 8 years. That is not incremental growth. That is a structural shift. Millions of new workers entered retail, logistics, healthcare, education, government services, and the private sector. This wasn't oil-driven expansion. This was growth unlocked by removing friction. Saudi Arabia discovered something many countries overlook: social rigidity can function like a productivity tax. By lowering it selectively, strategically, the economy expanded without drilling a single new barrel. But this creates a balancing act. The economy is liberalizing. Social life is loosening. Politics are not. This is not Western-style pluralism. It's closer to the East Asian development model: economic openness without political decentralization, opportunity without dissent. For a population that is overwhelmingly young, nearly 70% under 35, this trade-off appears acceptable. At least for now. Jobs, entertainment, income, a future. In exchange for political quiet. The state gets stability. But even this model has limits, because domestic reform alone cannot fund megacities, global sports empires, and trillion-dollar capital deployments. To sustain the pivot, Saudi Arabia needs leverage beyond its borders. It needs to ensure that global powers, especially energy consumers, play by its rules. Which brings us to the most dangerous part of the blueprint. Not economics, not culture, but geopolitics. In the next section, we'll examine the Saudi First doctrine, how Riyadh is repositioning itself as a non-aligned power, why it's willing to defy old allies, and how oil has become less a product and more a bargaining chip in a multipolar world. This is where the strategy stops being domestic, starts reshaping global power. Imagine you're the CEO of a company with exactly one major customer. That customer buys everything you produce. They guarantee your security. They stabilize your revenue, but because they are your only customer, they also dictate the terms, who you can work with, what risks you're allowed to take, and what happens if you step out of line. For decades, that was Saudi Arabia's position in the global system. The arrangement was simple: security in exchange for oil. The United States provided military protection, intelligence cooperation, and geopolitical cover. Saudi Arabia ensured stable energy supplies, priced in dollars, flowing into global markets. It was not an alliance of equals. It was a transaction. And for a long time, it worked. But the post-oil blueprint demanded something different. Because dependence on a single commodity or a single partner is the very condition Saudi Arabia is trying to escape. Under Vision 2030, Riyadh is no longer content to be a junior partner in someone else's system. It wants autonomy. That shift became impossible to ignore in 2022. Russia invades Ukraine. Energy markets explode. Inflation surges across the West. Washington calls Riyadh. The request is familiar: increase oil production, bring prices down, help stabilize the global economy and domestic politics. In the past, Saudi Arabia would have complied. This time, it didn't. Instead, OPEC moved in the opposite direction, cutting output to support higher prices. That decision wasn't ideological. It was financial. Vision 2030 has a price tag: megaprojects, infrastructure, global branding, industrial build-out. All of it depends on oil prices staying comfortably high, estimated around the $80 to $90 per barrel range. Budget stability mattered more than diplomatic tradition. That moment marked a quiet but profound change. Saudi Arabia was no longer managing oil for the system. It was managing oil for itself. And once that line is crossed, everything else follows. While Western governments lecture Riyadh on values and reform, another power shows up with something far more concrete: contracts. China has become Saudi Arabia's largest trading partner. It buys oil, builds infrastructure, and asks very few questions about internal governance. Discussions have even surfaced quietly about settling some energy transactions in yuan instead of dollars. That doesn't mean Saudi Arabia is abandoning the dollar system, but it does mean it's willing to signal optionality. Hey, and optionality is leverage. At the same time, Riyadh continues to buy weapons from the United States, coordinates production with Russia, normalizes relations with Iran through Chinese mediation, and explores normalization with Israel through American channels. This is not ideological alignment. It's transactional diplomacy. What can you offer me today? This is the Saudi First doctrine. A strategy built around hedging, not loyalty, gauging everyone, committing fully to no one. The goal is to position Saudi Arabia as a neutral, convening hub, a place where adversaries can talk, capital can move, and deals can happen regardless of global tension. A Switzerland of energy and capital, but with far more leverage. This approach thrives in a fragmented, multipolar world. It becomes dangerous in a polarized one. If tensions between major powers escalate over trade, technology, or Taiwan, pressure to choose sides will intensify. Neutrality becomes suspect. Hedging becomes costly. Saudi Arabia is walking a high wire stretched between giants. If it holds, the kingdom gains unprecedented autonomy and influence. If it slips, the consequences will be swift and global. And yet, even geopolitics is not the final pillar. Because oil, tourism, sports, and diplomacy all share one vulnerability. They exist in the physical world. The most important layer of Saudi Arabia's future strategy is not physical at all. It's digital. In the next section, we'll examine the quiet race unfolding beneath the headlines: how Saudi Arabia is buying computing power, artificial intelligence, infrastructure, and technological sovereignty in an effort to control not just energy, but the systems that will define the next century. This is where the blueprint stops reacting to the future and starts trying to own it. Up to this point, the Saudi pivot has been visible. You can see the stadiums. You can see the resorts. You can see the cranes cutting into the skyline. But the most important investment Saudi Arabia is making right now is almost entirely invisible. It doesn't photograph well. It doesn't trend on social media, and it doesn't generate memes, because the real future isn't built out of concrete. It's built out of compute. While public debate fixates on which chatbot is smarter, Saudi Arabia has been quietly racing to secure something far more fundamental than consumer-facing AI products: the infrastructure beneath artificial intelligence itself. This is where the blueprint becomes long-term, and where the kingdom reveals how seriously it understands the next phase of global power. Artificial intelligence is not just software. It is an energy-intensive, capital-heavy system that requires three things at scale: compute, electricity, data routing. Control any two of those, and you gain leverage over the third. Saudi Arabia intends to control all three. State-linked institutions and universities have become aggressive buyers of advanced AI hardware, particularly high-end accelerators used to train large models. These are not symbolic purchases. They are capacity bets. At institutions like King Abdullah University of Science and Technology, Saudi Arabia has built one of the most heavily funded research environments in the world. With deep state backing, laboratories are expanding supercomputing clusters, recruiting global AI researchers, and scaling data infrastructure at a pace that rivals far more established tech hubs. This isn't about competing with Silicon Valley startups. It's about sovereignty. Saudi leaders are acutely aware that they missed earlier technological revolutions: industrial manufacturing, consumer electronics, software platforms. They don't intend to miss this one. Artificial intelligence has been elevated to a national priority, treated less like an industry and more like strategic infrastructure, comparable to ports, pipelines, or power grids. On the surface, building massive data centers in the desert sounds irrational. Cooling costs are high. The climate is harsh. Water is scarce. But strategically, it makes sense. AI consumes enormous amounts of electricity. Saudi Arabia can supply energy at scale, at relatively low cost, and with growing renewable capacity tied directly to hydrogen and solar investments. Geographically, the kingdom sits at the intersection of Europe, Asia, and Africa, an ideal position for routing global data traffic. New submarine cable projects are being designed to turn the region into a digital crossroads, not just an energy one. And then there's culture. Saudi institutions are developing large language models optimized for Arabic and regional contexts. That may sound niche, but it's deeply political. Language models shape narratives. They encode norms. They determine which knowledge is amplified and which is filtered. Saudi Arabia does not want the future of Arabic language, history, and cultural representation mediated exclusively through Western platforms trained on Western assumptions. This is not just technological independence. It's informational control. If Saudi Arabia controls energy and compute, it doesn't matter who wins the AI race in terms of consumer apps. They still own the infrastructure everyone else depends on. This is the endgame most people miss. Not post-oil revenue, not tourism, not sports, but platform leverage. The same way oil once underpinned industrial civilization, compute will underpin the next one. And Saudi Arabia is positioning itself to be indispensable to both. But ambition at this scale always carries shadows. So far, we focused on strategy and momentum. Now we need to talk about risk. Because if this blueprint works, Saudi Arabia reshapes its future and its role in the world. If it fails spectacularly. In the next section, we'll confront the dark side of the plan: the burn rate, the demand problem, and the geopolitical fault lines that could turn the most expensive transition in history into a cautionary tale. This is where the balance sheet comes due. Up to now, the Saudi pivot looks bold, coherent, relentless. But no transformation of this magnitude comes without stress fractures. And if this blueprint fails, it won't fail quietly. It will fail in concrete, steel, and balance sheets. Because when a country spends at the scale Saudi Arabia is spending, time becomes an enemy. The first fault line is simple and unforgiving. Cash burn, megacities, global sports contracts, tourism infrastructure, entertainment ecosystems, AI compute clusters. None of this is cheap. even for an oil superpower. In recent years, Saudi Arabia has run budget deficits while issuing debt to finance its ambitions. That alone isn't alarming. Many countries do the same, but it introduces dependency. The entire model assumes oil prices remain high enough to fund the transition while it's still underway. Most estimates place that break-even range around $80 per barrel or higher. If global demand weakens, if a recession hits, if geopolitical shocks push prices down instead of up, something has to give. Projects slow, timelines stretch, confidence erodes. And history shows that half-finished megaprojects are worse than none at all. They don't inspire faith. They signal overreach. Which leads to the second risk, the ghost town problem. You can build cities. You can't force people to live in them. Saudi Arabia is betting that scale, novelty, and luxury will attract residents and tourists in sufficient numbers to justify the investment. But novelty fades. And global consumers have options. If demand falls short, resorts sit half-empty. If business districts struggle to fill, if tourism flows plateau, the return on investment collapses quickly. China offers a cautionary parallel, not a prediction, a warning. Entire districts built ahead of demand, oppressive skylines with sparse populations, capital tied up in assets that never fully activate. Spectacle alone does not guarantee sustainability. The third fault line is the most dangerous of all, geopolitical crossfire. The Saudi First doctrine works best in a fragmented world. It thrives on hedging. But if global tensions harden enough, rivalry between major powers escalates into direct confrontation, hedging becomes harder. Pressure to choose sides intensifies. Neutrality becomes suspect. Technology controls tighten. Trade routes politicize. Capital flows fragment. Saudi Arabia's position between competing blocs is a strength until it isn't. And when balance breaks, consequences arrive quickly. Economic retaliation, security recalculations, diplomatic isolation. This is the price of playing the center. And yet, despite all of this, the blueprint hasn't collapsed. Which brings us to the final question. Is it working? In the last section, we'll deliver the verdict, not hype, not dismissal, but a sober assessment of what Saudi Arabia has achieved. What remains unresolved, and why this may be one of the greatest beat-the-clock challenges in modern economic history. Because the desert remembers everything. Sue's the Saudi pivot working? Here is the honest answer. Yes, and that is precisely what makes it unsettling. Saudi Arabia has rebranded itself faster than almost any nation in modern history. In less than a decade, it has shifted global perception from a closed petro-state to an ambitious, controversial, but unavoidable actor in the future economy. It has diversified revenue streams beyond oil. It has liberalized social life more in 7 years than in the previous 70. It has demonstrated that with enough capital and centralized political will, change can be forced at scale. Most countries talk about reform. Saudi Arabia executes it. But this success exists under a shadow. Because the clock is always ticking. The global energy system is changing. Electric vehicles are scaling. Renewables are expanding. Efficiency is improving. Whether peak oil demand arrives sooner or later is still debated, but the direction is not. Hydrocarbons will matter less over time, not disappear, but lose leverage. That means Saudi Arabia must finish building the next economy before the old one stops paying for it. This is not just diversification. 'Tis a race against physics, technology, and global behavior. A beat-the-clock challenge, unlike almost anything in economic history. If Saudi Arabia succeeds, the outcome is extraordinary. The kingdom doesn't just survive the post-oil era. It emerges as a 21st-century power with influence spanning energy, capital, data, and technology, something closer to a G7-level node than a resource supplier. A country that controls energy flows and computational infrastructure. A convening hub in a fragmented world. A state that turned resource wealth into platform power. If it fails, the desert tells a different story. Empty megacities. Unfinished monuments. A kingdom remembered not for decline, but for attempting the most expensive transition ever, just a few years too late. So what's the bet? Never bet against someone with $1 trillion and a deadline. Because desperation plus capital plus centralized control is a powerful combination. And history shows that when states act early before collapse forces their hand, they sometimes rewrite the rules. The post-oil blueprint is not guaranteed, but it is real. And it is already reshaping how nations think about survival in a world where resources fade. Technology accelerates, and time punishes hesitation. So now the question turns to you. Is NEOM a visionary experiment or an over-engineered illusion? Is Saudi Arabia building the future or buying time? Read the comments. The debate has already begun. Thanks for watching.